Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
All right, and welcome to the GSMC television podcast brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Casey. So today we'll be covering 4 topics. First off, we will be talking about the very first episode of Falcon and the Winter Soldier that did premiere about a week and a half ago. I am a little bit behind, I will fully admit that, but I will be saving the discussion of the second episode for next podcast. My second topic will be about the unfortunate ending to what truly is a great sitcom, Superstore. And I say unfortunate because, not because the show itself or the finale was bad, but more so because it was such a great show and it really did not have to end. The third segment, we'll be talking about Mr. Robot. Now, I did talk about that in my previous podcast, just, a little, toes in the water kind of thing. But I definitely want to dive into Mr. Robot as I now am nearing the end of the series. And I will try and keep it spoilerish free. And for the final segment, I will be talking about my all-time favorite show, Lost, as I am now gearing up to do a rewatch, but have not officially done the rewatch. I'm trying to get through a couple other shows before I really dive into that one. All right, so starting off with our first segment, we will be talking about Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Episode 1. So we talked about previously WandaVision, which was another Marvel show that obviously ended a few weeks ago. We had a 2-week break before we dipped into Falcon and the Winter Soldier. So with this, I only watched the first episode so far, and I have not watched the second episode. I will admit I am behind. I just got a little busy with work and watching a ton of other TV shows, really. But with the second episode, I will definitely be watching it tonight or tomorrow before I gear up to do the next podcast. Plus, it keeps it more fresh in my mind in that way. So with this episode, and you know what, I should actually preface, this a little bit more, but I will be fully honest. I was not expecting much, or not really had high hopes, not really looking forward to this show in general, but I think in the reality of it, it's because we don't really know a ton about Falcon. We don't really know a ton about the Winter Soldier. I think we really know surface details about Falcon, and we know a little bit more about the Winter Soldier, obviously given his, original entrance in Captain America, the First Avenger, which was obviously during the first phase. And then we got more during the actual Winter Soldier, which is truly one of the best Marvel movies that has actually come out. And then we got even further with Civil War and Infinity War, and not really during Endgame, because at that point he was blipped and wasn't in the show, or in the movie. So yeah, I mean, they came off as somewhat more bland characters, especially given that you get to know, I don't know, like 50-plus characters throughout all the Marvel movies, easily 50. So, like I said, I really wasn't looking forward to it. So anyway, I mean, I'm kind of dragging on about this a little bit, so let's actually jump into the show. So I guess my initial thoughts were, I'm going to keep an open mind. I don't really know where this is going to go. But I quickly found myself very interested in it. There wasn't a ton of action because a lot of it was set up, but obviously the initial hook of this episode was that they kicked off the action. And obviously it wouldn't make sense for the Winter Soldier, Bucky, to be in all this conflict. But Falcon, on the other hand, he's working with the military, and they obviously introduced the big bad, who is actually a pretty famous UFC fighter. At least I believe that he'll be the main villain for the show. But I could be wrong. But anyway, yeah, they kick off with a bunch of action, some explosions, gunfire, pretty typical stuff. Something that's at least stimulating enough, visually on that end. And so, we then, after that little intro, we got some interesting tidbits with both Falcon and Bucky. Bucky now lives in New York, and he is really only has one friend, which is this old elderly man, and he's kind of keeping a low profile. And with Falcon, he returns back to Louisiana, where his family is, which we knew nothing about his family because I believe he lived in D.C. before, and he never talked about his family. He barely even talked about the years that he served, I believe, in the Air Force. So it's very interesting. We get to see, a deeper side of Falcon, especially. Marvel has a lot of these humorous tidbits. It's got its own very unique brand of humor, which can either be very hit or miss. Sometimes you're definitely going to laugh, and then other times you're just going to be like, okay, I understand that's a joke, and it is what it is. It's just their banter. But I thought it was really interesting, though, that there is this, his parents are dead, and he's been gone for 5 years, but his sister was still there, struggling to take care of the business. She had 2 kids, and he missed out on that whole section of their lives. So we got a lot of really good background when it came to his family. Now, another thing that really opened up the show was after the initial action sequence, we saw Falcon holding the Captain America shield, and he's all dressed up in a suit. You're almost kind of under the notion that he's going to a funeral, but obviously it's him giving up the shield to be put in a museum. But obviously that's not what we thought we were getting at all with this, because at the end of Endgame, Captain America passed the shield to Sam. And for those who don't know, in the comic books, Sam does actually become the Captain America in the comic books. I believe, if I remember correctly, Captain America dies in Civil War, which obviously in the movies we did not get that. But in the comics, he dies during Civil War, and the mantle is passed to Sam. So during that, Sam does take up the role of Captain America, and serves as Captain America for a little bit, not too long. I don't remember the exact details, but spoiler alert for the comic people, Captain America comes back. He comes back to life somehow, and so the shield and everything's returned back to Captain America, and everything is perfectly fine again. Which is something that we're obviously not going to see in the shows or the movies. There's no way that they're bringing him back to life. So he gives up that shield to the museum, which then we later find out in the show, the ending, we have a character who is also in the comics. I don't know if they actually officially mentioned him by name in the TV show, but a man named John Walker, who the government now announces is the new Captain America, which it's so funny. The internet really took this and ran with it with all the memes that have come out. He, people saying that he looks like the old man from Up in the Captain America outfit. People just generally spreading a lot of hate about this guy. And he literally was only featured for like 3 to 5 seconds. So it's absolutely insane that people went crazy over this, but I think, people are attached to Captain America. People are a little bit attached to, Falcon, and they wanted to see him be Captain America. But obviously, in my mind, it's pretty obvious what the outcome of this show is going to be. It's going to essentially be Falcon struggling with his family issues. You get to see that and the effects of not being around for, 5 years because of the blip. Then you got this new man being Captain America and Falcon doing his stuff. And then it's probably going to come to the very end of the season where Falcon's like, I want to be the Captain America. Who knows? Maybe John Walker, will be a villain or one of the villains. Maybe it is all an act. They'll set up villains. John Walker will take them down, and it's just all theatrics. Just to make the American people feel better, and that was the whole reason. That's the whole reason why they wanted to bring him back. Because Captain America not only was a person, but more so he was a symbol in the Marvel Universe. Now, I mean, there's a lot of people that talk about, people aren't ready for Captain America to be, a black man, which I think is, in one sense, could be very true. But I think, at least for us Marvel viewers, I think we are all ready for it, and we all know it's going to happen. I see no opposition for any sort of reason. But maybe that's the way that it is in the universe, which was something a lot of articles wrote about too. So going on the other side of the tracks, we have Bucky. Now with Bucky, we didn't really get a whole lot of him. I mean, not only was Bucky gone for 5 years, but Bucky is over 100 years old, although he's got the physical appearance of someone in his maybe late 20s, early 30s. But I mean, he was born in the early 1900s. He served in World War II, which is when he originally died, so to speak. And also with that was then experimented on, where he was an assassin for like 70 years. So now that he's no longer truly the Winter Soldier, that, the conflict of the Infinity War is over, Thanos, everything like that. He's struggling with a lot of his own personal demons. And we see that with the nightmares. But you see a very early shot, which you're not sure if it's a dream or if it's a flashback, which, I mean, it's actually really both, because he's having a nightmare about a previous experience he had as the Winter Soldier, where he killed an innocent man just trying to get into his room because he had witnessed the Winter Soldier assassinating a group of, wealthy individuals or politicians. You're not really sure who they are. So the man who he killed, was a grown adult. I believe he was Chinese, which factors in, obviously, to the story at play, where, as I mentioned previously, he's friends with, an elderly man. That elderly man is also, Chinese, or, of Asian descent. And so you can pretty much piece together that that's the guy's son. And that guy's distraught, and he's kind of a bitter old man because, or not necessarily bitter, but he's a angry, grumpy old man. He keeps to himself. He complains about, the other tenants and things like trash, as we see. It's just really, really, trivial things. But the one person who he kind of gets along with and enjoys talking to is Sam. Or not Sam, I'm sorry, Bucky. And so you also have this storyline where their favorite restaurant, there's a female server / bartender who's always there, and you can tell that Bucky's kind of, smitten, and so the old man tries to set Bucky up with her. And so they end up going out on a date, but, his past is brought up, and especially of the assassination of the old man's son. And so it's a very upsetting moment, to watch unfold, not only because you do get to see this shrine the old man had to his son, but also because you can see the trauma and guilt rids Bucky, or, that riddles Bucky with it. So he cuts the date short, and, that's more or less the extent of his storyline. I feel like there was a lot more going on with Falcon this episode, but with Bucky, I think it was a teaser enough. We've already known more about him, so I'm perfectly fine with, the focus being on Falcon, because we need more of Falcon than we do of Bucky. And so I think people are really starting to come around, and I think the whole thing with John Walker being the new Captain America really actually helped the fans connect with Sam more and, have more, sympathy for him. But once again, Sam didn't really want to be the new Captain America, and we even saw that in the movie where Captain America's like, how does the shield, feel? And Falcon's like, feels like it's not mine. And, in a sense, it isn't his, but it is his now because it was given to him. The mantle was passed. So, that is the arc I believe we're going to see in this first season, is him coming to terms with not only everything that's happened in the 5 years that he's missed, but everything with his family and him rising to the occasion to be the next Captain America. As for Bucky's a little bit harder to figure out where his story's going. And I think it's perfectly fine that Sam's storyline is a little bit more predictable. They generally do say, I learned in film school and, taking all my screenwriting class that, like, some of the best films are the more predictable thing. It falls within this Hollywood formula of how a narrative should be structured and written. So once again, I think we know what's going on with that. I think we know who the four major players are, who the villains are, who the heroes are. You could still make the argument that Bucky himself is an anti-hero, but I don't know where his storyline's going. I think it's pretty obvious at some point the old man will find out of who is responsible for his son's death. And who knows, maybe Bucky will try and find happiness in a relationship. But I don't think that is going to be anything that's going to fully come to fruition by the end of this first season. All right, so coming up next, we will be talking about the series finale of Superstore.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. Keith keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
All right, and we are back. So the last segment we talked about Falcon and the Winter Soldier. So now we're going to pivot to Superstore. So before I really get into it, a little background on Superstore. For those who, don't or even do watch the show, some of you guys might not know this, but Superstore was created by one of the producers of the show The Office, which obviously in recent years has picked up a huge cult following. Not to say that it wasn't popular during its, run, but since its redistribution on, Netflix, it definitely has picked up a huge audience. So with Superstore, it's got a similar vibe where you follow a group of people, an ensemble cast of workers who work in a superstore, a big box store similar to Walmart. I'd definitely say very similar to Walmart because, let's be real for a second, Walmart definitely has a certain vibe to it, if you will. So Yeah, you follow these workers and even some of the customers to an extent in their weird shenanigans, very different people of different races and all walks of life and ages and whatnot. So you get a very colorful spectrum of people. And with Superstore, it's not filmed in a mockumentary, so it's not as in your face as The Office is. But I would definitely say Superstore is... I like it better than The Office, despite a few setbacks, which is not the show's fault. It might even be a better show than The Office. I think the show, The Office is a pretty good show. But anyway, I kind of digress with that. I do think that Superstore has been one of the best sitcoms of the past decade, definitely probably in the top 3, alongside, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia and Modern Family, which I think is the best, but yet again, I digress. So I wanted to, address everything that happened with this show in the pandemic leading up to this final season and now series finale. So... aside from the first season, which had 11 episodes, seasons 2, 3, and 4 all had 22 episodes, and the previous season, season 5, was also supposed to have 22 episodes. But, unfortunately, the pandemic messed up the last episode, which was supposed to be California Part 2. But honestly, in a sense, because of everything, it was better that it got ruined when it did, because they were able to pivot very well. So it was announced at, I believe, the beginning of February of 2020, that they were renewing Superstore for a 6th season. Following that, towards the end of the month, they announced, unfortunately, that America Ferrera, who... in one sense, I would argue was the main character of the show, even though it is an ensemble cast, that she was leaving. If I remember correctly, she wanted to leave, I believe, just due to, I think she just had a kid and she wanted to spend time with her family and, kind of step back from her work. So they never got a chance to finish that final episode, episode 22. So the 5th season only ends up being 21 episodes. But once again, because of the pandemic, which is the reason why that last episode's not in the season, they were able to get America Ferrera to finish her storyline and actually create almost a precursor episode to California Part 2, which ended up being the 2nd episode of this most recent season. And with that, they did an episode called Essential, and I actually thought it was pretty good. I know there's a fair amount of people who love their sitcoms, and when they watch their sitcoms, they don't want to be reminded of life. They want to kind of get lost in, the absurdity or the humor. But Superstore was one of the few television shows that actually decided to tackle what was going on in the pandemic. And I think they did it in such a creative way that was so humorous that, despite it reminding you of the unfortunate situation in this world, I think it really actually, I looked forward to it every Thursday. It really took my mind off things a lot. Superstore was definitely one of the shows that I did look forward to the most. So anyway, going back to it, they did, the Essential episode, and then they did California Part 2, which essentially was America Ferrera's departure from the show as her character moved to California, and her breakup with her boyfriend and long-running love interest throughout the whole series. Very similar Jim and Pam trajectory, although these characters are not Jim and Pam by any sense of the imagination. So I know there were some people that felt as if Superstore went into, let's call it a lull, for a couple episodes where they were kind of trying to re-find themselves, which I hear, although I don't watch the show Mom, I hear it was a similar thing with Mom, but Mom bounced back with the departure of, oh goodness, I can't remember the girl's name. the girl who played in all the scary, Anna Faris. Oh my goodness, Anna Faris. So anyway, some people argue that there was a lull for Superstore. Honestly, I don't really think so. Maybe a very tiny dip in quality as they rewrote some of the dynamics of the show. But I think honestly it performed pretty much just as well without her. It just was unfortunate that we got that. So then Superstore was in a very limited production for the fall time slots, and by the beginning to mid-December, they had announced a spinoff called Cheyenne and Beau. And now, obviously, anyone that watches the show knows that Cheyenne is one of the main characters. She was, in the first season, a teen mom, or she was pregnant, so she wasn't a teen mom at that moment. And Beau is her very, in my mind, obnoxious, childish, delinquent husband who she does end up marrying. I really thought he was the only character that was annoying in the entire show. I did not like him. So I was excited for a spinoff, but at the same time, I wasn't looking forward to it because of Beau. Which also alongside with the spinoff, they announced that Superstore was getting canceled, which was very unfortunate that they were canceling the show, but then deciding to create a spinoff. Maybe the environment or the setting for which Superstore takes place was just proving to be too difficult in pandemic times, which I completely understand that. And I've heard a lot about that where, leading up to this season or during the filming of the season, they had a lot of conversations with the multiple production departments as well as the actors about how they should do things and testing all the different types of masks, stuff like that. And I think it was just proving to be very difficult. I know at one point they almost settled on having face shields, but, obviously there's a lot of lighting on the sets, and there's reflections and camera and tons of crew, if you know anything about these productions, film or television-wise. And that just proved to be too difficult. So we, at that point, were about probably 5 or 6 episodes into the season, and when they announced it would be about 15 episodes, which is what exactly it ended up being, 15 episodes. And so they had a lot of storylines that they had to wrap up. Now, the one thing I do appreciate is that with sitcoms, dramas do it too, but sitcoms do it in a much different way, where sitcoms are able to at least prepare for an ending because they write so many episodes, shoot so many episodes, and edit so many episodes within a certain amount of time. So usually sitcoms, while a season is airing, they're still filming the show itself. So the awesome part of this whole thing is at least Superstore knew that they were getting canceled, and so they could wrap things up. So there was a bit of a, period where they were trying to wind things down and rush storylines along. I think it was most prominent with the Dina Garrett storyline. Love both of those characters. Then with departure of Amy and Jonah and his love life being, kind of really the only major romantic focus throughout the series, you had a couple smaller things like Sandra's marriage, but there's the reintroduction of Kelly, who was Jonah's previous girlfriend before he officially got with Amy. And so she was introduced, and that thing was kept completely under wraps by production and everyone else. They did a phenomenal job of it, because that oftentimes happens with a lot of television shows, is that these television shows, they release the cast lists and the cameos and everything like that. So if you know anything about some of these dramas, you know which characters are returning or what actors are playing what. And, people love to post things like that. And it's just kind of very unfortunate because it ruins the surprise of it all. So anyway, you had the reintroduction of Kelly, and they almost make you think for just a second that maybe Jonah and Kelly are going to get back together. Because you know what? Jonah and Kelly were actually really good together. But unfortunately, it was a 1-episode cameo as she works at the other Superstore, and it was kind of, I feel like, just a little tease. They're just teasing the audiences with that. But then right after, they start to introduce a new love interest for Jonah. But then she ends up being revealed to be a lesbian, and Jonah's very embarrassed by that. And then he almost finds another love interest, who he does start actually dating within the final few episodes. But the cool thing is, given that they knew that it was the finale, they approached America Ferrera, and she immediately was on board. And that she knew that, you know, the ending would not have been the ending without her. They needed her. And so I appreciate her, you know, coming back into the show for the final 2 episodes, which both of those final 2 episodes aired on the same date of March 25th. So in the finale, you have, right before the finale, so the 3rd episode, you get a tease that the Superstores are probably closing, which is the reintroduction of Amy. So technically she was also in the 3rd episode, but the whole 2nd episode is about one of the representatives coming to their Superstore to check things out, but it's supposed to be kind of a surprise visit, and no one knows that the Superstore is closing, or not many people do. So they try and make things look perfect. And so, but then, yet again, as another running gag, there are more body parts in the store, and they're trying to hide that, and they're trying to hide this disaster, but it all gets ruined, and Amy, who was kind of trying to hide in the store away from the representative to control things, ends up revealing herself to talk to the lady, and it is revealed that they will be shutting down the Superstore, but it will be turned into a fulfillment center. And so Amy then quits because she, I guess, thinks it's her best play in helping her friends keep their jobs. So anyway, the final episode is just kind of a goodbye and a final sale for the Superstore. It's revealed that Dina will become the manager of the fulfillment center, and she's able to bring along 5 employees with her. The rest of it has already been hired. Glenn, focuses on retirement. Mateo thinks that he is going to lose his job because he's in fear of deportation. So you get a really nice conclusion where all the major characters all end up in an awesome, situation. Glenn, now with the Superstore gone, has no competition for the original family business from when he was a kid, Sturgis and Sons, and opens up a store where he brings Cheyenne as a supervisor, because she was the floor supervisor in this final season, and Mateo is one of the assistants because despite Mateo's attitude, he actually is a really good worker. And Cheyenne and Mateo have a lot of chemistry. So the 3 of them work in the Sturgis and Sons store, which could potentially be a really good setup for the Cheyenne and Beau spinoff, because then you at least know that you have 2 beloved characters and Beau in this spinoff. Then in the fulfillment center, you have right at the end, Dina is struggling to pick a crew, and Sandra, who's had a very conflicting relationship with Dina the whole time, she comes in and chooses the 5 people for her, and she writes AM next to her name for assistant manager, and you have a really nice moment between Sandra and Dina. And so of the major characters, you have Dina, Sandra, Marcus, who was the warehouse manager, and Justine, who was, not a background character, but she was a supporting character with a lot of pathetic, sexual jokes, because she clearly is not truly as social as she wants to give off. And then you have Amy and Jonah, who by the end do get together, and you kind of see the flashes of the future of their life. Amy finds another executive job. As she mentions, it's easy to get into the executive field once you're already there. And Jonah runs for city council, which feels like a very fitting thing given everything that Jonah has fought for throughout all these seasons. And then they even have another kid together. And so it's been at least a few years down the line, because 2 of the kids, Parker, who was born 2 seasons ago, and this new kid who we don't know when he was born, they're in bunk beds. So it's probably been a couple years. So the show really ended on a nice note. As far as series finales goes, it wasn't the most amazing thing, but given that they were able to end it on their terms and conclude things well enough, it was a pretty solid finale. Because I find that a fair amount of finales end up being duds, to put it simply. So, I mean, that's kind of it with Superstore. It's really unfortunate that it got canceled. It had a great 6-season run and felt conclusive. But they did just announce the other day, following the finale, that the spinoff has been officially canceled. So, in one aspect of it, I am upset about it. I think I could have definitely dealt with the Bo situation, but it's just unfortunate. We had a really good story and a really good crew and really, really good writing, and it is all now finished. All right, so we're going to go on a little break, and when we come back, we will be dipping into our next segment, which is Mr. Robot.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, and we're back with our next segment. We're going to be talking about Mr. Robot. We just previously finished talking about Superstore, kind of the series overview, and more specifically, the unfortunate series finale. Once again, not unfortunate because it was bad, but because it was such a great show that unfortunately got cut too soon. Okay, so going into Mr. Robot, I briefly talked about it on my last podcast. I did a segment of the 5, how did I word it? Not unseen, hidden gems. Hidden gems is what I said. Hidden gems that I was actually currently watching this season. So part of the reason I wanted to talk about Mr. Robot now is not only to deliver this information to you guys, but, you know, it almost works as a sort of journal for me as I am now approaching the end of the series. But I'm mostly going to stick to, you know, non-spoiler. I'm going to try and be completely spoiler-free. But more so, I want to kind of talk about the first season. So, before I get into it, Mr. Robot had 4 seasons. It premiered on USA, and it ended in 2019. You know, for the most part, all the seasons are about 10 to 12 episodes. It fluctuates between the seasons. But I have had such a phenomenal time watching this show that I'm really trying to draw the show out so it doesn't end for me. I did address it previously before, and this is definitely not going to be the last time you'll hear of it. But I myself am not a fan of binge-watching television shows. I just really don't think that's the way to watch TV. I think your mind only absorbs so much information in a short amount of time. And yeah, so I don't binge-watch things anyway, so I'm really trying to draw this out. But this show is so incredibly well done, and you can tell in the writing itself that this show was not written necessarily from season to season. The creator, Sam Esmail, I think that's how you say his name, you can tell he, similar to like Vince Gilligan with Breaking Bad, that he knew where he was going. You know, there are twists, whether they're minor or major, in all 4 of the seasons, but you can connect the dots when you go back to these episodes. there's a twist in the first season, and you can go back and, watch the episodes over again in a whole new light, knowing that that information was there all along. And with season 2, it's the same thing. You have hints that tell you that this was there all along. Then you can even go in the 3rd and 4th season, where some of the twists itself end up becoming something much larger than you might have originally thought. And so you see the twist for, let's say, season 4, for instance, and you're like, whoa, that is absolutely crazy. And then you're like, oh my gosh, I can see it now. They said this in season 1, or they did this in season 2, and it was there all along. And some of the twists and turns, I've actually predicted myself. I feel, I got a little pride, when it comes to, predicting certain things, because I like to really look in depth with a lot of different TV shows, even my sitcoms. I did the same thing with Superstore. I was like, oh, Marcus is definitely going to get the warehouse job because he was the warehouse manager or fulfillment center, so just kind of connecting it to a different TV show, but still, nonetheless, it's really well done, like everything about this show. So I kind of want to talk about the first season. You can find Mr. Robot as of now on Amazon Prime. To my knowledge, I don't believe it is on any other platform right now. No Netflix, no Hulu, definitely not like Disney Plus or Paramount Plus. But you can watch it all on Amazon Prime, which I'm sure most people have. And I would recommend, even if you're on the fence with this TV show, just watch the first, I'd say 5 minutes, maybe. Pretty much the intro segment to the whole series. There is a scene between the main character, Elliot, and the owner of a coffee shop. And that's most of what I'm going to say, because once again, I don't want it to be spoiled for anyone. But the dialogue is so enticing. The character of Elliot, who is the main character of the show, keep in mind, there's something off about him. This antisocial behavior, these weird mannerisms of his body language. There's something weird about him. You definitely can tell he's one of those people who are kind of hyper intelligent. And I mean, the whole show, for those who don't know, is he is a hacker. And more specifically, he gets recruited by a hacktivist group. That is the whole premise of this show, is, he's a hacktivist. And so the whole beginning is just a really back and forth between the owner of this coffee shop and Elliot. And if you're not hooked by that, I mean, maybe the show isn't for you, but even so, I would still give it at least one season. Definitely watch, a couple episodes of the show. I guarantee you'll like it. But it's just really crazy to me that this show was on the air for 4 years. 4 years. And while it was actually nominated for a number of awards and it won a number of those awards, it's a show you really don't hear anything about. It's mind-boggling that that's the case. So, talking about, some of the major players at hand in the show, or even more specifically, the first season, you have an interesting dynamic between Elliot, once again, who is the main character of this show, and Mr. Robot. A character that's introduced pretty much right in the beginning of the show. So you have an interesting relationship with them, as Mr. Robot is the head of an hacktivist group called F Society, which, I mean, works on a couple different levels when you think about it. So once again, you have the interesting relationship between Mr. Robot and Elliot, the leader of F Society and a genius hacker, Elliot. Then you have an interesting relationship with another one of the F Society members, a girl named Darlene, and her kind of on-again, off-again love interest, Cisco, who works for the Dark Army, which is a very dangerous Chinese hacking group. Think of them almost as a internet mafia, if you will. Then you have 3 other members of F Society. There's not a whole lot of members of F Society. You have Trenton, Mobley, and Romero, each very unique and interesting in their own ways, and you get more about them. Romero is an older gentleman. Mobley is how would I describe him? Mobley kind of brings a lighter energy to the hacktivist group, and Trenton is a Muslim woman, a young Muslim woman at that. She, I believe, is 19 in the show. Not exactly the woman you would have thought would have been in the group, but nonetheless is a very intelligent woman, which is clearly why she was brought into F Society. Then you have a couple other characters who are also, main characters as well. You have Shayla, who is Elliot's drug dealer and also next door neighbor. So there's a very interesting dynamic that goes on between them, even the whole drugs aside. Then you have Angela, who is Elliot's longtime friend. The both of them lost their parents. Elliot lost his father, and Angela lost her mother, both to cancer due to a leak at the Washington Township, I believe it was a power plant. And so the both of them know about, and the whole world knows about it, but it was buried up by the corporations, that E-Corp, or as it's often said as Evil Corp in the show, so they have a vendetta against Evil Corp, the both of them. Then you have Krista, who is Elliot's therapist. Very Tony Soprano and Melfi vibe from her and Elliot in their relationship. I almost feel like while Krista is still a very prominent figure in the show, her role is not as large as Dr. Malfi was in The Sopranos. You also have the role of the friend. Now, the friend is an interesting fourth wall break where we are the friend, and Elliot narrates the whole show, but given that he is socially and mentally off a bit, he gives off this very untrustworthy, narrator type vibe, very similar to I don't know, probably most of the literature you read in your high school literature class. But still, nonetheless, very interesting as he talks to us the entirety of the series. And then the last 2 people you have are Tyrell and Joanna Wellick. Tyrell works for Evil Corp. He's one of the higher-up executives on a really good trajectory. And you have Joanna, who's his wife, and they're kind of like sharks. They are determined. Now, she is definitely more of a housewife-type character, but I actually really more so see her as a similar character to Robin Wright's character in House of Cards, how Frank is obviously the politician, but she elevates him, she drives him, and they work together in a power dynamic. So that's the vibes that I get from Tyrell and Joanna. Now, of all those, a little interesting tidbit as we start to pivot things. Each of the episodes have very unique names. They're essentially titled as what are they called? Digital container formats, which, are movie files and picture files and sound files, which kind of gives it, plays into the whole, technology theme of the show. So a big thing about this whole show is that there is a very, very interesting monologue, which I originally heard when the show first came out, but then once again, the show kind of faded into oblivion to an extent, which is why I feel like a lot of people haven't heard of it. But there's a very interesting monologue that he gives to the friend while he's in his therapy session. And he talks about how the true ruling group of the world are the 1% of the 1%. And so, he has a very clear disdain for capitalism and these corporations that are essentially ruling the world. Another really interesting dynamic of this show is everything that happens in the show, as I kind of did previously mention before, is definitely really well planned out. You can tell that things are not written spur of the moment. And in addition to that, too, everything that does happen with these characters are definitely the effects of real-world consequences, let's call it. So, without ruining anything, if something crazy were to happen to one of the characters, or even, let's say, results in the death of a character, it's not some sort of shock, factor sort of writing. There is a big reason behind it. There were mistakes that were made by not only those characters, but potentially the effects of certain villains or even protagonists in the story. They caused a terrible ripple. It reminds me very similar of how Game of Thrones operated. The big thing, and spoiler alert for anyone who has not seen Game of Thrones, although it's been finished for a while, but, Season 3, you saw the death of, right towards the end of Season 3, the death of Robb Stark, who was one of the major players in Game of Thrones. But if you looked back at everything that happened in Season 1, but even more specifically Seasons 2 and 3, while it looked like he was doing a good job because he was winning a lot of battles, he made a lot of really bad moves. Now, Robb Stark was very young, but the effects of all of his terrible moves that he made in the Game of Thrones, as they say even in the show, led to his death. So this is something very similar that Mr. Robot does, but they do it very well. There are a lot of shows that really do kill characters off for shock value. Mr. Robot is not one of them. So I think overall that is just kind of a brief overview of Mr. Robot, kind of giving you some of the characters and, how the show operates. But I definitely think it is definitely a hidden gem. And I would highly, highly, highly recommend giving it a watch. And like I said, just, at least watch the first, segment of the first episode, and I guarantee you'll get hooked. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we are going to be launching into the final segment of this podcast. We're going to be talking about my favorite show, Lost, kind of a retrospective before I give you another official retrospective, because I'm going to be starting my rewatch really soon.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
All right, and we are back with our fourth and final segment of the GSMC television podcast. So we just previously wrapped up talking about Mr. Robot, kind of gave you some of the key points, the players and everything. But like I said, definitely check out the first episode. So now we're going to pivot to my all-time favorite show, Lost. Now, I just will say for the record, the way that I distinguish some of these things of, favorite and good is that, with it being my favorite, it subjectively is, in my opinion, a great show. Objectively speaking, though, I do not think it is the greatest show that has ever existed, but it is still a phenomenal show. Now, unlike Mr. Robot, I will admit that Lost had a general idea of where certain things were going, but Lost had to roll, and I really mean roll with the punches over the years. A lot of stuff happened during the course of the 6 seasons that the show was on, and so we will be talking about that a little bit. But just to give you a little bit more background, I'm not going to talk about too many of the key points of the show, just in case maybe someone decides they do want to watch Lost. So, first off, Lost aired back in September 22nd of 2004, and the show concluded at the end of the 6th season on May 23rd of 2010. Now, the crazy thing is that Lost started when I was in elementary school, and it ended when I was in high school. I was a huge Lost fan from the beginning. I can still remember when Lost aired. I believe, technically speaking, I started watching Lost during the second episode, because technically the 2-part pilot aired in 2 segments, I'm sorry, well, of course 2 segments, but it aired over the course of 2 weeks, pilot part 1 and pilot part 2. Now, I can specifically remember, vividly remember, being in my bedroom, flipping through my little 20-inch tube TV on this, little table that was essentially my entertainment center with my, VCR and, I don't know, I think it was my N64. It was some game system. But I remember the TV and flipping through the channels, and I have absolutely no clue what even caught my mind about that, or caught my eye about that show. And so I'm watching it, and I'm like, this is a weird show, but I can't seem to really turn it off. And so I'm watching, and there's a little twist ending that really hooks the audience in with a, WTF moment. And I was like, what is this show? Oh my God. So, because I didn't really know of the show, I sort of lost touch with, when the show was airing and all this other stuff. So a couple weeks go by, and I remember my mom at the time was working a couple jobs, and one of her coworkers, or maybe one of her clients, had mentioned that they were watching Lost. Now, the funny thing is that Lost was breaking records left and right at the time of the airing of the show. And so, it's just crazy that I didn't see any advertisements for it. So anyway, she mentions that, she's going to watch the show, and so somehow we ended up watching it as a family, my mom, dad, me, and my brother, my sister at the time, who was very young. I mean, that just was too much for her. So we started watching it, and man, we were all hooked, and the show at that point was already 6 to 8 episodes in. So, I think we all went back and we had watched the remaining of the episodes on demand. Comcast On Demand was kind of just a thing as of the past few years when the show was airing, I believe. So I think that's how we watched the previous episodes or something like that. But yeah, ever since then I was hooked. Lost is literally the exact reason why I'm so big into television and even film, and why I went to film school and do all this work with video editing and, sound. But I have rewatched, I should say, Lost, pretty much 11 times over the, 17 years that it's been out. it truly is a phenomenal show. The first season especially is a very character-driven show. The island in which they... Well, you know what, actually, before I even get into that, so for those who don't know, the whole show is about a group of survivors who crash on a mysterious island. That is the basic premise of the show. It is another show that has an ensemble cast. I mean, you can argue that there is a main character, but it's an ensemble cast. And the show is told through, you know, each episode's told through the perspective of another castaway, or however you want to refer to them, and you get their flashbacks, and you get maybe why they were on the plane, or what they're struggling with, and every character is very unique. One of the really unique characters, too, that you really have to think about the context of the times in the early 2000s, was a character on the show named Saeed Jarrah. And now Saeed Jarrah was an Iraqi soldier. More specifically, he tortured people for the Iraqi military. Now, I believe originally he was a communications officer, but his story, I mean, really kicks off in what they show you during his days as a torturer. So you do have to remember that at the time, we are only a few years after 9/11. I mean, there is this sense of unity in the United States, but definitely also a unity against terrorism, you know, as the media pushed it. And I mean, of course, yeah, we were against terrorism, but also there was a lot of, you know, hate against Middle Eastern people. So to have a character who is Middle Eastern, worked for the Iraqi military, and was a torturer. He tortured, you know, American soldiers or other Iraqi people or whoever, you know. It's a pretty bold character choice, but people loved him. And, you know, sometimes it's really little things like that where you get to know someone on a different level. And, you know, it gives people a better understanding. So yeah, you just had a lot of really unique characters. Now, another thing, too, to note is, if I remember correctly, because, you know, during the years of Lost, there was a lot of stuff that happened with the show, nothing controversial, but a lot of stuff that happened with the show and the network that, like, at the time, they were kind of telling us the truth, and they were telling us their version of the truth, but then it was, like, years later that, like, things came out where things are a little bit more clear. But at the time, ABC was not doing very well as a network, if I remember correctly. And then, during the fall 2004 time slot and the winter 2005 time slot, you had two shows that pretty much completely revitalized ABC, and even in my mind, and this might be a bold statement, but I do really stick by it, is that these two shows, being Lost and Desperate Housewives, elevated television, and even more so, dramas, to a whole other level that you never had them before. And you know, I think these shows were a precursor to the golden age of television that we now live in. Think about the stories and everything that has come out in, you know, the past 5 to 10 years. And I really think it really is because of shows like Lost and Desperate Housewives. So, with Lost, I mean, you had most of those early seasons averaging on about 15 million viewers. I mean, that's a good amount. Even by the sixth season was averaging, and I think the fifth season as well, they were averaging about 10 to 11 million viewers. The height of the show's viewership, though, was season 3, which is often, while I think it is still a phenomenal season, is often looked at as a boring start. And even maybe the worst season of the 6. And that had the highest viewership. It had almost 18 million. It was averaging almost 18 million viewers. So, I mean, that's still a phenomenal thing. So, I feel like also recently, Lost has gone through a sort of small resurgence, where there's even been kind of talks about potentially doing like a remake, or, you know, rebooting it, or doing a continuation or spin-off series, which personally, given the way that the show ended and everything that we saw, I think the show's fine the way it is. Maybe if in my opinion, in another like 10 years, they decide they want to remake Lost, fine. I mean, I think the show, for the most part, has aged really well. There are maybe a few comments here and there from characters that have not aged that well, but it's mostly like really early season stuff, mostly like season 1 and to an extent season 2. But yeah, I think the show is, really aged very well. Now, a lot of people, or actually, let me go back to the resurgence. So yeah, there's been kind of resurgence, talk in the media, a lot of, interviews and podcast stuff with, the creators and some of the line producers and all those other people that worked on the show. And this is where some of the information's getting clarified about them rolling with the punches. Because throughout the series, you had a number of characters that they did kill off, not even necessarily for intended story purposes, but because the actors wanted to move on to something different. Like, even though the show was absolutely insanely popular and it could be great for almost anyone's, career, it's crazy that people wanted to leave this. And then there was like one or two people, I believe Michelle Rodriguez was one of them, who was kind of getting in trouble, and they kind of maybe wanted to drop her for image purposes, but also she was getting wrapped up in the Fast and Furious movies, I believe, at the time as well. So you had a number of actors that left for that reason, which drastically changed the outcome of, the rest of the seasons and the future of the series. In addition to that, one of the biggest upsets was during either right before they started season 4 or during season 4, you had the big writer's strike. And when I tell you that really messed things up, that really messed things up. But it had a very interesting pivot in the series which also you had them, I believe, switching over a lot of camera equipment, as a lot of companies were now starting to create HD content, and there were HD channels that were being released in the mid to late 2000s. So there's a massive pivot in the second half of the series in terms of technology and storytelling, but I think it was done at just the right time. Now, another thing you had too with these types of shows is that with, nowadays you have stories that are more flushed out, and, like Netflix, for instance, they only like to do 3 seasons of a show, although it's not really for storytelling purposes. Netflix actually does that for financial purposes, where they don't want to have to continuously up the salary of their people, of the actors. So it's very rare that Netflix shows get more than 3 seasons. But anyway, so it was kind of a big fight for the creators and producers of Lost to try and end the show on their terms. And then kind of as they were starting to settle to a point where they were going to end the show, the production company, ABC, comes back with saying, okay, yeah, we'll end it after 10 seasons. And then you have the main 2 producers and creators that are like, we are in the middle of season 3 and certain reception's not that good and we're running out of stuff. So yeah, let's not do 10 seasons. So then the writer's strike happened, really cut down the number of episodes for seasons 4, 5, and 6, respectively being 14, 17, and 18 episodes apiece, whereas the first 3 seasons were 25, 24, and 23 per season. So, I mean, that was another thing, too. It was very interesting to not run a show into the ground, kind of letting them end things on their terms. Now, Lost did get a little bit of negative reception towards the last season as well, but more specifically the series finale. And I used to be very involved in a number of the forums, and I even started like a Lost club at school where we would discuss things. It seemed like on the internet, a lot of people did not actually understand the series finale. They massively misinterpreted the ending of the show. So the interpretation for a lot of people destroyed the whole perception of what the television show was. Although there is a very vital piece of information, a monologue delivered by one of the characters that explains what the whole show came to, the whole conclusion of the show, and I think it was very well done. I actually really love the finale of Lost. It's very sad, it's very conclusive, and it wraps up a number of the mysteries. Now, there are certain mysteries that will always be mysteries, because the show Lost is a show of mysteries. So with this resurgence, sorry, I know it's the third time going to it, but with this resurgence, you do have Lost on Hulu now, so you can watch all 6 seasons on Hulu. I would highly recommend watching it, and I hope to, within the upcoming episodes, start to get to rewatching Lost. And when I do get to my Lost rewatch, I will be talking about it a lot more in depth, probably talking about a couple episodes at a time and making references. I'll have to pull out even my old journal where I made detailed episode notes, even, down to the continuity errors. But anyway, that is my all-time favorite show. And this is the retrospective before the retrospective. So thank you for listening into the GSMC Television Podcast, brought to you by GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask you guys if you could please remember to subscribe to the show, write a nice little review because it really helps us out. And also if you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, it would be very, very much appreciated. Thank you for tuning in and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Television Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.